extent of the lockdown in India was very severe. And as a result, activity fell to lows that haven't been seen historically in India, but also elsewhere in the world. If we don't control it, we have to wait for a vaccine. And vaccine is not likely to be rolled out until probably first or second quarter of next year.
Are there any two new normal habits that Dr. Rajan has acquired?
Oh, peace and quiet, no travel. I'd love to do that.
You're a sports person though, marathoner.
I'm a half marathon. And I have started playing tennis again.
Interesting books.
I just finished Bipin Chandra's book on the freedom struggle.
Do you really like movies or songs?
Old Hindi songs. That's my favorite. Mukesh, Mohammad Rafi, and that stuff.
You've worn so many hats. Anything very close to your heart?
At the RBI, there were a number of days where when you went back home, you said, we really did something today. It's hard to beat that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rajan, for making time for India Podcast listeners and viewers. And of course, it's an utmost delight for me to have you with me on this show. Thank you so much.
Of course, happy to be here.
Dr. Rajan, I would like to begin. It's been almost 4 months. We have been living with the virus, the COVID-19, to say so. And it's quite undiscovered phase we are still in. But at this point, the vaccine race has also begun. So do we see that the recovery pattern has already begun, or we see it coming around soon? And to specifically figure out which sectors would you see the recovery pattern to come around? Do you already see the green shoots there?
Well, first, of course, the extent of the lockdown in India was very severe. And as a result, activity fell to lows that haven't been seen historically in India, but also elsewhere in the world. Which means that once you let go, there will be a sharp recovery for some time. I mean, I've seen numbers, for example, retail car sales went down to zero. Well, obviously, once you open up, you're going to get car sales picking up. The question is, how far up does it go? And that depends on two or three things. One, of course, it depends on the pace of opening up. Are you opening up all parts of the country quickly? Are you opening up every business? Because if people don't have jobs, people aren't working, people aren't getting salaries, they don't have the ability to consume. So opening up is one important factor. Second is whether the factories that open up can produce, because their supply chains may be in places that aren't exporting to them. They may be in parts of the country that haven't opened up. So you need, as much as the demand side, you need the supply side to come back up also. And the third factor is consumer behavior. Are people sort of so shell-shocked by this that they change their behavior and don't want to spend because they fear that it may come back in a bigger way, or something else may happen? If such things can happen today, can't something worse happen? So people who have very modest savings may want to build up their savings. And so consumption may also fall for that reason. People may become more frugal. So this is what we have to wait and see.
So even when the opening up happens, will that fear psychosis play a role, the panic, the real consumption pattern to come back on track? Because
it will take time. It will take time. And for sure, it will require, one, that we control the pandemic. I mean, who's going to go to a crowded restaurant, if they fear catching it? So we need to control the pandemic. And it may be, if we don't control it, we have to wait for a vaccine. And a vaccine is not likely to be rolled out until probably, the first or second quarter of next year, even with everything going as planned. So given all that, I would say there is still big uncertainty about how quickly we can open and how much we can open. We should not be fooled by the pent-up demand that we see in the short run. Yes, agricultural demand is there. Yes, there is pent-up demand. Some factories are very happy in the short run. The question is, once that pent-up demand goes, is there going to be something behind it? And that's the big worry.
Dr. Rajan, the lending slowdown, the issue has moved from the supply side to the demand side. How do we see a kickstart in the credit demand? Because it's also the question where the growth capital will come from, because the regulator is quite on the side of patient capital, like wait for it, slow and steady. So how do you think the kickstart of the credit demand can come by?
Well, I think first you need real demand before you get credit demand. And if people are worried about real demand, there is no credit demand. If I'm not making sales, I don't need working capital financing because I'm not producing and so on. But I would also say that, let us not mistake the lack of demand for saying there is nobody who can benefit from credit. It may be that there are over-indebted firms that, today know that when they go to the bank is going to laugh them out because you have no collateral, you have no capacity to borrow, and I'm already risk averse. Why should I lend to you? So I would be very careful. I mean, again, I was at a meeting of small and medium entrepreneurs from Kolkata and Chennai, and they are in a bad way. Yes, I would argue that right now, certainly credit, if it was offered to them, I think they would take it. But many of them, seeing their situation, don't really think they will get access to credit. So we need other parts of the economy to fire, but we should also not be complacent that the lack of demand is purely because of lack of demand. It may also be people who see the other side and say there's not going to be any supply if I go and demand it because the banks are totally risk averse, a point that I think the RBI has also been making.
I think you really went into my next question of banks being risk averse, but actual measure of the impact of COVID-19 would be assessed when we see the financial institution quite recognize the NPA, which is with the ending of the moratorium period to say so. So in that sense, we know the NPA rate would increase drastically is what has been insinuated in the financial stability report also recently. So how do we look at things further? One, you have always, you were the pioneer into bringing into recognition the NPA issue. And also, would you support with the IBC going on a halting now? Restructuring outside the court could be one way. So this whole NPA burden, the capital required by banks, everything seems to be a complicated issue for banks being risk averse for that reason.
Well, I think it is complicated. It is difficult. Let us not minimize those issues. But not doing anything is the worst thing possible under these circumstances. There's a temptation to say, let me push it out into the future. Bad loans don't get good with age. This is not like wine. They actually get worse. The longer you avoid dealing with them, the more the company gets into trouble, the less the promoters want to invest in the company, the less they care about it because they know it's anyway a bankrupt entity. And so, companies don't revive on their own. You need a concerted process of revival, which means fixing the problems and sometimes recognizing the losses. Sometimes you make more recovery from your loan by writing down the debt and saying, if I keep it at 100 rupees, it's going to make it difficult for this firm to get any working capital loan. It's going to be difficult for it to even operate. And the promoter is going to lose interest. That 100 rupee loan, if I keep it at 100 rupees, is going to give me back only 50 rupees when I sell off the plant and equipment for in a liquidation sale. On the other hand, if I write it down to 80 rupees, and the promoter has the ability to borrow and invest in working capital and so on, maybe that 80 rupee face value loan will be worth 80 rupees. So restructuring sometimes can be beneficial even for the lender if it makes an asset which is deteriorating in value and continuing to deteriorate a better asset. So that's really what banks have to think about. The problem is outside of bankruptcy, especially the public sector banks, but also the private sector banks, are very worried about writing down debt because they fear they will be accused of being playing favorites, this, that. Various inquiries and investigations will be started. They need to have greater confidence that they can restructure and not be accused of corruption. And for that, banks also have to put in place structures which allow bank officers to take decisions reasonably and not face inquiry commissions. There will be the odd corrupt official. We have to find a way that you can get them without halting the whole process.
So with extension of moratorium, even if the NPA rate pile-on increases, it's okay to do with it for now because we are in pandemic. So there's no way out for anybody, right?
Well, I think the moratorium will have to come to an end at some point, because the longer the moratorium lasts, the more the unpaid loan becomes, and restarting payment becomes more difficult. So, I mean, one of the experiences, if you recall, with the Andhra Pradesh microfinance crisis was that once you told people don't pay, it became very hard to get them back into the payment habit, because they hadn't saved any money, they didn't have any money, and as a result, those became serious NPAs. A lot of microfinance institutions were severely impaired after that, and so we have to be a little careful that the longer we tell people not to pay, the harder it will become for banks to eventually collect anything on those loans. And so, yes, some moratorium was warranted, but it now has to be a little better targeted.
Dr. Rajan, you've always emphasized on inflation containment as being important to focus on the growth trajectory of the economy there. Simultaneously, now that we have, because of the situation, crossed that boundary of plus minus 2% with 4% there, is the focus required to be there on the growth trajectory? And can we reasonably be focused around that going further?
Well, one of the institutions which is working well for us right now is the central bank. The credibility of the RBI is one reason why the currency hasn't plummeted, despite sort of our inability to contain the virus, or as you said earlier on, fears about our growth trajectory as well as our fiscal situation. So people still have confidence in the rupee, and it's very important that that confidence continue. For that confidence to continue, it is important that the Reserve Bank show commitment on inflation. If there is no expectation that the Reserve Bank will contain inflation going forward, there'll be more worries about the rupee plummeting, and that could be a source of concern going forward. So I would say the inflation targeting regime has served us well, and it is important the RBI continue to emphasize that it will keep inflation within those bands. Yes, occasionally, as we see in the current situation, it may go outside because of some disruptions, but it should be that it will come back within the band in reasonable time. And that will, in fact, give the RBI more flexibility to do what it's doing on the liquidity side, on supporting various forms of lending, but also even in supporting government debt. So these, I would not disrupt this by, at this point, saying, should we still be targeting inflation or should we move to something else? It's actually served us quite well, and let's recognize that, rather than a whole set of dialogues which take us nowhere.
True to that. The new economy that you've been talking about, we are with the new normal way of life. What does new economy mean, particularly for India, where the demographics is quite young? Are we there? Are we headed towards a new economy now?
No, I mean, certainly our young population gives us the scope to do a lot of things quite differently. And the pandemic has highlighted different ways of working. So, one example is what we're doing right now. We're having an interview at a distance.
Yes.
I've certainly started teaching at a distance. I taught an entire course with a colleague, Austin Goolsby, on the net last few weeks. And what that does suggest is that some of India's strengths or some of India's capabilities can be augmented through distance learning done more effectively. The university I'm associated with, Kriya University, has gone online over the last quarter, and next year will largely be online till we get the virus sort of fixed. So given that, I mean, that opens up a huge set of opportunities, right? Why can't we teach not just in India, but elsewhere in the world? Let's first start teaching in India effectively. Teach a lot of kids who are left out of the sort of elite system with good material and with good teachers. But also, can we expand that outside? Telemedicine. Can we start offering medical services across the globe? I mean, a lot of people can't actually get to see a doctor, but a lot of consultation now has moved online. Initial consultation, where some machine takes BP and takes the stethoscope, but the doctor gets the reading and then asks you your various symptoms and diagnoses you. So can we do more of that? Now, in all these, we have certainly strong resources, but our country also needs a lot more of it. We need a lot more doctors to attend to Indian problems. So can we do telemedicine in India? Can doctors in Mumbai treat today patients in Bihar, which is having an outbreak of the virus? So can we learn from this? And, I wouldn't call it a silver lining because this is really a tragedy, but can we at least do some things in a different way? And that will enable us, if we can create a market for our services globally, we can leapfrog the manufacturing stage, which we haven't really picked up so much on. We still do need manufacturing to create the jobs for many people, but can we add high quality services across the world? That certainly we can think of.
Dr. Rajan is a part of my show segment. We have a caller here. We have Mr. Srinath Sridharan coming up with a couple of questions for you. He's a business leader there who comes up with certain questions you want to take with you. So here, Mr. Srinath, welcome to the show.
Good afternoon, Doctor. So I had a question which is more targeted towards your views on the cryptocurrency. I know as a couple of years ago, you were not I think too ready to recognize it as a formal currency. But of course, as a professor of finance, what would your view be, considering that quite a, let's say, bit of development, not just on crypto, but more about blockchain and banking technologies have emerged? Do you think it is safer to bring them to mainstream finance?
So actually, we just came out with a report from the Group of 30 on central bank digital currencies and stable coins, which addresses some of these issues. It actually was released this morning, so it's fully appropriate that you asked me. I have always been of the view that financial innovation shouldn't be shut down, that we should allow it to emerge. In some ways, we should experiment in a contained fashion. The mistake is to either shut it down or to let it flourish without any controls, without any regulatory structures monitoring it, because it could become too big and then you recognize there are lots of problems with it. So contained experimentation has always been my view, which is why when cryptos came out initially and there was more of a wave in favor of them, the RBI in my time basically said, be careful, but didn't ban the cryptos at that point. And I think that, going forward, what we see today is the Chinese central bank is going to come out with its Chinese digital currency. And if other countries are coming up, India will have to explore this going forward, the possibility of a rupee digital currency. Now, there are lots of problems with a digital currency also, that they're not, including the technology, the possibility of hacking, the question of information. If the central bank gets all the data on what transactions you make, on the one hand, that's good for the tax authorities. On the other hand, it's bad for privacy and so what kinds of structures over and above the technology do we put in place? And should it be the central bank which issues the digital currency, or should you have a variety of private digital currencies, or can you have both? A hybrid model, many digital currencies competing with each other, but with the central bank also issuing. And should the central bank issue, or should it let, the same way as cash we deal with today? The central bank gives the cash to the banks, but the banks issue it to their customers. The central bank doesn't issue currency directly to most customers. So are there, structures like that we should be thinking of? Certainly, I would say this is a good time for us to start thinking about how we move into this area. What is interesting is, of course, the reduction in transaction costs, but also the ability to use data effectively. I mean, if you can use data for inclusion, for enhancing credit growth to sectors of the economy that are excluded right now, because you can monitor their transactions better, that's a good use of the data. And so there are possibilities created by cryptocurrencies, including central bank digital currencies. Not all of them should have the same structure as Bitcoin. But I think we should learn from the experience with these currencies and think of how we move forward.
Thank you. The other question that I had is, as we see the run-up in the stock markets the last many, many weeks, and we always say the last one holding the bucket seems to be the retail investors. And if I correlate to the famous adage, never waste a crisis, what would you advise, or let's say if your friend were a retail investor, what would you let him know?
Well, I would say that markets are generally quite efficient. And as you said, retail investors have the least information as they go into the markets. And so the best thing to do is be reasonably well diversified. A lot of the easy money has already been made in the markets. Don't try and, for fear of missing out, enter the party just when it's going to end. So I'd say, make sure that you're balanced against different scenarios. You may believe there's a strong probability the markets, the economy may come back. But if you're close to retirement, don't put all your money in the stock market. Keep a lot in safe instruments, because there is some probability it may not, and things may be much worse. Vice versa, if I was relatively young, I would say, I can afford to lose a little bit more. So I'll put some in the stock market, but I won't put everything, because I don't want to be left high and dry if it collapses. So diversification is important, both across sectors, but also across instruments. Some real estate, some gold, some bonds, some bank deposits, and some stock market. Don't be overly exposed to any particular one. No matter what the pundits say, and the pundits obviously have a line to push. So by all means, listen to what the big bull has to say, but recognize that he's in a different position than you are.
I'm happy you said the last line.
So the last question I have for you is, we have a very famous quote by ex-regulatory head who said, the regulatory body is independent and I have the approval of the government and bureaucracy to say so. And when we look back at that statement, it's so true. And the concept of power has to be balanced with accountability. Sure. And I think times like these are unprecedented. And what do you think a banking regulator can do better? Because whatever you do, you're judged by what is not done. And that's a tough position to be in.
Well, this is a time when you need to do a lot, because as everybody knows, these are unprecedented times. And I think this is also a time while you have to maintain stability. Not being more bold and forceful can create an instability. So if you are passive and say we're doing what we've always done, you may not be reacting enough to the circumstances. So it's a difficult situation. How do you convey the impression and the belief that you're doing prudent things, but those prudent things have been thought through carefully enough that they're actually quite beneficial and are out of the box thinking. So how can you think out of the box while being conservative? That's really the challenge at this point, because you don't want people to lose trust in the central bank or the regulator. But at the same time, you don't want the regulator or the central bank to follow the old playbook, because the old playbook just went out of the window. So how can they create a new playbook in this environment and be seen as reasonable?
So that sounds like Dr. Rajan's paradox to me.
That's
Dr. Rajan, last caller there is really fond of you. He's a teacher from Kolkata. He's been teaching thousands of students for free, but a real passionate admirer of yours in our show for Voices That Inspire Us. We have Rajeev Poddar there.
Hello, sir. I can't express.
Hello.
Hello, sir. I can't express how delightful and lucky I'm feeling to interact with you. And I can't ever thank Anku for giving me this opportunity. I'm a teacher of economics, and I am so fond of reading all your writings. And all my students, I keep up telling them, sir said this, Raghuram said this. They won't believe कि मैं इसके साथ आज आपके साथ interact करूँगा. It will be a big splash headlines tomorrow in all my classes. Thank you very much, sir. Coming back to the question, sir, I can't express it. I'm blabbering a little bit, but can't express it, sir. I'm so happy right now to see you in person, sir. I'm coming back to the question. I wanted to ask you a few questions. One question, basically, it was about the rate at which the currencies are being printed all over the country, all over the world by the central government, the helicopter money which you said. Do you think it will create a lot of serious side effects in the medium and short term, especially for India, a country like India, because the inflation might shoot up, the currency might weaken, and people are saying the cure might be worse than the disease. Yeah. So what is your opinion regarding this helicopter money which is going all through the world?
It's a very good question. But think of how it is happening, right? It's not actually, in many cases, money printing. What the central banks are doing is issuing more reserves. This is not currency notes, but these are reserves which the banks are forced to hold. So where does that money go? The central bank is issuing the reserve to the banks, and then buying. In issuing the reserves, it's buying bonds, it's buying foreign exchange, etc. So when you look at the RBI, I think it's currently borrowing about 7 lakh crores from the banks through the reverse repo. Now, so long as the banks are reluctant to lend themselves, effectively what the central bank is doing is becoming the intermediary between the banks and whatever assets need to be held.
Perfect.
Now that can happen so long as the banks aren't willing to lend.
Right.
When the banks want to lend some more, when they feel there is some use for the assets for the money that they're parking with the central bank, that's when all the issues that you said can start becoming more front and center. There will be more credit growth. There will be more of a fear of inflation. And at that point, it is quite important that the central bank reverse what it does. Sell back some of the bonds into the market and so on. Now, that has to be managed very carefully and sometimes can be disruptive. But right now, I would say with these banks themselves, not being willing to lend, there is still some room to do this.
Do you think that do you think that I read somewhere that UK is going to contemplate that giving helicopter vouchers, like vouchers for everyone to spend, because people are now more averse to spending. They're saving money. Even if they get the money, they're saving it. So do you think that electronic vouchers or the vouchers can really play a part in creating demand, and that might be a more effective tool rather than giving them money in the hand?
That can, but I would say it's focused on a different purpose. The voucher which expires. Now, that is not perfectly effective, right? Because if the voucher expires, I'll use that rather than use my money. So long as I was going to spend, I'm going to use the voucher, but not the cash I have. So it may not increase the overall spending. It may just substitute one form of spending for another. So that one has to be careful. Those clever ideas sometimes don't work.
As bad ideas, to say.
But if I give a voucher to a man who has no money, he's obviously going to spend it. Right. So giving it to the relatively poor is going to be a way of getting spending up. But that's one way of getting demand up. But that poor person would also benefit if you gave him cash directly. You don't need to give him that exploding voucher. You could give him cash and then he would know that I can spend it or...
I got it. But it might sound all the glamorous, but it won't work, you think, that effectively.
Well, I think it will work a little bit, but not as big as we think.
I'll just be a little. I will just be a little bit greedy, sir. Can I just? Today there was rumors about some news about some amnesty scheme for gold. Said that Indian government is contemplating. The finance minister is making a scheme about amnesty scheme for gold. Do you think that will work?
But,
Do you think in this time it can work something like this? VDIS for gold. That people come out and.
I don't know that any of our amnesty schemes have brought in a lot of money.
No, not at all. Right.
Dr. Rajan, with that, a quick rapid fire, with people knowing you differently in the new normal phase we all have survived. Are there any two new normal habits that Dr. Rajan has acquired or would want to stick by for long?
Oh, peace and quiet, no travel. I'd love to do that.
Since you're health conscious, I thought yoga or something. You're a sports person, though, a tennis player, a marathoner, if that's the term to use.
Well, not marathon. In India, half marathons always become a marathon. I'm a half marathon. And I have started playing tennis again. Fortunately, they've allowed us to go onto the courts here. So I play tennis. I go for my runs. But, I'd love to be able to do a little bit of travel, but for fun rather than for business.
And two interesting books that you kind of resonate with and would like others to read through, maybe the young generation or aspiring.
Well, I'm reading some of the older sort of works on India. I just finished Bipin Chandra's and others book on the freedom struggle.
Okay.
Have been reading. At this point, I'm reading as a novel. I'm reading Hilary Mantel's book, which was just nominated for the Booker Prize on Thomas Cromwell.
Yeah.
Enough to keep me occupied on the side.
And those two you recommend, though. A very quirky one. Do you really like movies or song? Are you a guy who's more into movies or music? Any of your choice that you can remember on the top of your list?
But I'm sort of my tastes are relatively eclectic. So I'm not a sophisticated music listener. So I'm listening to old Hindi songs. That's my favorite. Mukesh, Mohammad Rafi, and that stuff. And I'm also on the movie side. We're all into Netflix and all those series. Ozark is something I find interesting, and right now my kids and I are watching The Good Fight.
Good Fight, okay. And the last question: you've worn so many hats. You've enjoyed all your roles that you've played and excelled in them. Anything very close to your heart? I know you don't regret anything in life, but I think that role is really something you carry in your memory as a good joy, a smile. A regulator, IITian, a professor.
No, every part of I have been lucky in that so far I haven't had a terrible experience, and I've enjoyed every role. So I wouldn't want to elevate anyone more than the other. I would say that at the RBI, one of the most joyous things was at the end of the day, you felt you really had moved the needle because you were relatively autonomous. You could do things on your own, and you didn't have to depend on permissions from elsewhere. So there were a number of days where when you went back home, you said, we really did something today. And, that it's hard to beat that. Other places, what you do eventually may have some effect. You write a paper, somebody may be influenced by it down the line. But sometimes when you can actually implement something, that makes a difference.
And you certainly was one of the most popular RBI governor we had, and you had a lot of fan following to say that. And thank you so much, Dr. Rajan, for your time, for accepting the interview request and coming for us. Thank you all, gentlemen, for being there. And it's a pleasure. It's utmost pleasure. Hope to see you in person someday. Please take care. Stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.